Joining. Welcome. It's nice to see all of your little Zoom pixel spots. I wanted to let you all know that we have some great upcoming trainings. Actually, this Thursday, we have the impact of COVID on equity in Boston Public Schools. We're going to be with the Rafael Hernandez School, which is one of our grant recipients from last year. So it's going to be a really interesting talk. Next week, on November 5th, we have Technology and League Leadership, which is going to be led by our very own Lynn Huckabee. If you are not in leadership, don't hesitate to sign up. We would still love to have you there, and it's a great sort of onboarding for all of the technology that we use in the leadership team, from OneDrive to Digital Cheetah. We're going to go through all of the ins and outs. Come ready with questions. And then the following week on Monday the 9th, Courtney Scrubs, our very own membership elect and also co-chair of the Board Seat Initiative, is going to lead us in an AGLI training about microaggressions, addressing microaggressions. It's going to be a really great talk with lots of breakout sessions, options for us all to kind of convene and be together and talk about such an important subject. So definitely sign up for that. Again, that's Monday, November 9th. There's also some great social events. I see a fitness class in November, a coffee masterclass. So we can all know about your wonderful upcoming events. Now, without further ado, I would love to introduce our speaker for tonight. We have Allison Lang with us, who's an associate professor of history at the Wentworth Institute of Technology. She received her PhD in history from Brandeis University. And her book, Picturing Political Power, Images in the Women's Suffrage Movement, was ways that women's rights activists and their opponents use images to define gender and power during the suffrage movement. She's going to talk to us about that tonight. Lang has also worked with the National Women's History Museum and curated exhibitions for the Boston Public Library's Lavinieth Map Center. For the 2020 centennial of the 19th Amendment, she curated exhibitions at the Massachusetts Historical Society and Harvard's Schlesinger Library. So excited to have you here tonight, Allison. Thank you for your time. I know we're all excited and want to feel empowered during this voting season. So I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you for organizing this. I'm delighted to speak with all of you today, especially about voting rights in this lead up to the election. Although, who could have guessed that voting would be so complicated? Even just casting one's ballot right now is something that we're having to think about in a way that maybe we never did before. So I'm really excited to speak with all of you today. And as I go on, you're welcome to put questions in the chat. Please do as we go. I'm happy to talk to you about any questions you have about the topic. So in addition to this being 2020 being an election year, it's also the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which many of you might have noticed lately, some centennial commemoration events around town. The Bunker Hill Monument was actually lit up in purple and yellow on August 26th to celebrate the anniversary, which was very exciting. If you didn't get a chance to see it, I'm sure a quick Google will get you a great picture. But I wanted to start really quickly just by thinking about what the word suffrage means, because it's not one that we actually use very much in the 21st century. It feels very out of date. It actually just means the right to vote. And so when we're thinking about this women's suffrage centennial, we're just thinking about women's voting rights. When I talk to my students about suffrage, often they think it has like some link to suffering or something, and that's actually not the case. It's just a very old-fashioned term that was very popular in the 19th century. And people talked about white male suffrage, people talked about black male suffrage, and for some reason, it really is stuck with the women's suffrage movement. And I think that's partially because the suffrage movement lasted so long, and it's far more recent than things like the 15th Amendment in 1870. So I think that's perhaps why. So I'm going to start us off. As you all know, we are going to be thinking about images a lot this evening. So I am going to start us off with some images. And go. And I'm going to actually start us off with more recent images because I want us to have a sense of the connections between the past and the present and the ways that some of these suffragists images and visual strategies are kind of still part of our current conversations and images today. So this is from the 2017 Women's March in Washington, D.C. And as you might immediately be able to see, there are several women's rights leaders whose heads are, painted on these posters. We have Susan B. Anthony is in the front wearing glasses, Eleanor Roosevelt, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, all of these women who these protesters, these activists have decided to commemorate. As you all probably remember, this was the largest single day protest in American history. And what's really interesting to me is this fact that these protests of 2017, long after someone like Susan B. Anthony was a women's rights leader, decided to look back and kind of recognize that there were a lot of people who came before them. And one of the things that I'd like to really talk about during our conversation today is why we remember Susan B. Anthony, because there are actually quite a lot of suffragists who are probably just as important as Anthony, but who we don't really remember. For example, in Boston, which is where I am zooming into you from, that is the place where Lucy Stone was a suffragist, and she had actually her offices for the Women's Journal, which was the longest running women's rights newspaper in the United States at that time. Those offices were actually right down at Park Street, right near the T stop. And Lucy Stone also was the head of the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was founded in 1870 and was in competition with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organization. And Lucy Stone's organization was far larger. So we'll get back to a little bit to that in a moment. But you remember these particular figures for a reason. This is another photograph that I wanted to point out to you. This is obviously a much older one. This is from 1913. This is Inez Milholland, and she is actually on the same street, Pennsylvania Avenue, that I just showed you in the previous slide. And if you've been to DC, you know that Pennsylvania Avenue is the street that is between the United States Capitol building and the White House. So this is an incredibly politically important street in the United States history. And this is Inez Milholland in 1913. She is going to take to the streets in the first national suffrage parade. And this was a very famous photograph. It was distributed a lot, it was reprinted in a lot of newspapers. Inez Milholland was known as the most beautiful suffragist. And she was thought of as someone who really represented the movement. She was one of the first women in the United States to complete a law degree at New York University, which was one of the few schools that admitted women. And so she was incredibly smart, even if she was also being valued for her looks. So one photograph that stood out to me this past summer, knowing Inez Milholland's portrait so well, is this photograph that became viral earlier this summer in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement. And it features a woman named Rihanna Noble riding a horse through downtown Oakland in California, and she has this Black Lives Matter sign. And there's just something that really, that people really found compelling. This is an image that was shared and written about over and over again. And you can't help but see the connections here. There's something about these women on horses representing political causes that, even over a century later, still feels really compelling In fact, Brianna Noble's image proved so compelling that it's actually now part of a commercial. And so, one of the things that I think is really interesting here is that she's not only representing this political movement in our 2020 world, she's also selling a product. And I think we could, talk a lot about the connections between social activism and consumption and advertising. That's the kind of cross-cultural um, uh, web that we've got going on in our 2020 world. Another thing that really stood out to me this summer, and of course I'm like showing you a lot of these protest images, which is very much a direct descendant of suffrage activism. This is on the bottom a photograph, one of the many famous photographs from the first picket of the White House, which happened in 1917. And if you've ever been to the White House over the course of your lifetime, you've probably noticed protesters there. There's just always someone protesting something. But in 1917, suffragists were the first ones to actually launch a picket of the White House. And perhaps you remember earlier this summer when Black Lives Matter was painted on the streets right outside the White House. And that really, to me, reminds us that this space is still considered to be this vital space of protest, a century later. Another thing you might have noticed in the news lately is a lot of female political leaders wearing white. They're wearing white to campaign events. This is actually a photograph from the 2020 State of the Union address. So this is intended to recall suffragists. We looked at that photograph of Inez Milholland a moment ago, wearing white on her horse as the herald of this parade. One of the reasons why suffragists wore white is because white has this connotation of purity and morality and all of these kind of idealized things that historically were associated with womanhood, right? On the other hand, the other reason why suffragists wore white was a very practical one, which is that they wanted to show up in black and white photographs, right? So this photograph was, when they were photographed for parades, they were these white figures on this black and gray toned backdrop. And then they would get reprinted in newspapers and be a far lower quality than we have today. And so these suffragists, if they wore white against these darker backdrops, they would really show up more. It would look like there were so many more of them there than if they were wearing darker colors that just blended into the background. And so this visual strategy is actually very much even part of our political culture in the 21st century. So I want to kind of go back. I want to think about why suffrage activists decided to create a visual campaign so that we would remember people like Susan B. Anthony, so that we would remember these iconic photographs, some of which we just looked at. And I'm actually going to start quite early. I'm going to start with this 1775 print by an artist in London. And I'm going to start here because I want you to see what these suffrage activists were contending with. These are the stereotypes of women in politics that were popular even from the nation's founding. So Philip Daw, he's a London artist. He's reading a newspaper article about these women in Edenton, North Carolina, who decided to boycott tea. So it's 1775, it's a year before the Declaration of Independence. We know, if you recall your history classes from many ages past, we know that there are these early acts of rebellion, particularly among women, to boycott tea, and this is one of them. Philip Daw probably had never been to the colonies, probably never went, but this is the scene that he decided to conjure up, to imagine here. So it's a group of women gather together to sign this boycott. They are not terribly feminine looking. They're not terribly idealized looking. We have this woman with a gavel who's seated. She has a very large nose, very large features. And the woman behind her also kind of has a grim look on her face too. In the background, in the middle, we have a woman holding a big bowl up to your face. If you've ever been to the Museum of Fine Arts, there's right in front of the portrait of Copley, that Copley did of Paul Revere, rather. There's the big silver Liberty Bowl that Paul Revere created, and it is a punch bowl. And these punch bowls were not for fruit punch; they were for alcohol. So when she is holding up this punch bowl, she is intending to show that she's getting drunk at this event. And the woman next to her is pushing, holding up the bowl so that she drinks even more. The women on the left are actually dumping out their tea canisters into these containers to get rid of their tea. And the women in the center are signing the document. This is a very large group of women, and all of them are ignoring the child under the table. The only thing paying attention to the child under the table is the dog who's licking the child and also urinating on a tea canister. So this is the scene of women who have abandoned their domestic duties. They've abandoned their families in order to participate in politics and sign this petition. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. The other person I want to make sure we point out is the Black woman who is behind the woman with the gavel. She's looking at this document. She's holding a quill and an inkwell. She also looks like she is interested in signing this. So the suggestion here is from Philip Daw, who's overseas in London, imagining the scene to make fun of the colonists. The suggestion is that this woman is also interested in signing this petition and therefore really challenging the racial hierarchy, white supremacy that's in place, but also she's interested in challenging this institution of slavery. You know, this is Edenton, North Carolina in 1775. She's intended to represent an enslaved woman. And so there's this idea that if you allow women to participate in politics, then Black women will also want to participate in politics. And that will challenge not only the patriarchal structure, this structure of men in power over women, but also the racial hierarchy that's in place at that time. And of course, as we all know, slavery was one of the central underpinnings of the British Empire. So this was a scene that was supposed to make people laugh, but it was also supposed to make people incredibly anxious about women participating in politics and certainly interested in making sure that did not happen. So as we're thinking forward here, so that was 1775. I'm going to shift forward in time quite a bit to 1851. And this is a print that comes out, as women are starting to organize. So if you kind of remember your women's history class from your textbook, probably there wasn't that much in your textbook, unfortunately, but women started petitioning and joining organizations to support women's rights in the 1840s. 1848 is when that Seneca Falls Convention, that famous Seneca Falls Convention happens. And in 1850, the first national women's rights conventions are held. Actually, both in 1850 and 1851, they're both held in Worcester, Massachusetts. So this is a moment when women's rights activism is on the rise. It's becoming more visible in a way that it certainly was not in 1775. And it's starting to feel like a real threat. And this happens to be at the same time that women are starting, that images are starting to be easier to reproduce, cheaper to distribute. And this is just one example of the many images that were popular at the time. So in the center, we have a woman who's representing Mrs. Turkey, a women's rights leader. And she's wearing bloomers, which you can see she has pulled up just slightly to reveal her ankle. And you may not think much of seeing an ankle in 2020, but in 1851, seeing an ankle was quite scandalous. And she has her hand placed, rather condescendingly on her husband's head. And her husband is kind of hunched all over as an old woman might be. And he is sewing clothes, doing this very menial labor. Both of them are ignoring the child in the front who is crying. He also has a banner saying "No more Papa and Mama," right? So she is abandoning her home, her family, in order to run these women's rights organizations. In the background, we have two women who are more than happy to join her. One is a white woman, and I think she is intended to represent a working woman, a domestic servant. She holds a banner that says "No more basement and kitchen." So she is challenging the class hierarchy that's in place. The woman next to her is a Black woman, and she is smoking a pipe, and she is protesting slavery. So this is an incredibly similar image to the one we were looking at from 75 years earlier. Very similar themes, very much the same humor, very much about if women are challenging the gender structure, then all of these other social structures may fall too. And I want to show you another image that's from the same year, just to give you a sense that these were incredibly popular pictures. This is the equivalent of kind of viral images of the 1850s. These are images that people would have come across over and over again, and they were incredibly similar. This, you see another more women smoking. They're wearing bloomers. They've got riding crops in hand and kind of like aggressive postures. There's also even a bulldog here. It's not a cute little fluffy parlor dog. It's a very very bold, assertive dog. The only man in this scene is actually has his back to us. He's fleeing the scene, and we also see two women linking arms. And that's because there's this idea that if women are starting to take on these more masculine roles, that maybe they won't want men anymore. Maybe they won't need men anymore. And there are certainly plenty of examples of women's rights leaders who were in long term relationships with women. But that is definitely not something that women's rights leaders ever chose to advertise. So it was very much a secret within the women's rights movement. So this is an image, a print done in 1869. So nearly 100 years after that first image. But as you can see, it's remarkably similar. This is by Currier and Ives, and they were an incredibly popular print firm in the late 19th century. If you've ever heard the Christmas song Sleigh Ride, they mention Currier and Ives in there. So they were very much kind of part of American culture of that time. One of my favorite components of this print is "Vote for the Celebrated Man Tamer, Susan Sharptongue," which just feels, not even 1869. That feels like something someone might say, or something along the lines that someone might say about a woman running for office, even in 2020. The other component that stands out to me is this woman on the right who is holding her fist up at her husband and telling him that he must take care of the baby while she goes to vote. Because there's this idea at this time that if women take on men's tasks, that men will have to take on more womanly tasks, like caring for children. And so a man carrying babies in these cartoons is basically kind of like symbol for the end of the world. Very much not, what we think of today. So you can see why suffragists wanted to change the stereotypes that they had about them. And one of the first women to do that in a really consistent way was Sojourner Truth. And Sojourner Truth was born in the late 1790s in New York, and she was enslaved for the first 30 years of her life. And when she was free, she actually became a really popular anti-slavery lecturer, women's rights lecturer, very much involved in the reform movements of the 1840s and 1850s. By the 1860s, there was a new kind of visual technology, these carte de visite photographs, which are the images that I'm showing you on the screen. And they look like they could be any size, but in reality, they're very small. They're baseball card size. And I always tell my students, you trade them with your friends. You want, one of these carte de visites of your favorite actors, you want one of your favorite author, you want one of the president, right? Because otherwise you can't just Google to find out what the president looks like. This, having a photograph is the closest thing you've got in the 1860s to that. So Sojourner Truth decides to sell her photograph to promote her causes, but also to raise money to support herself. Because being a reformer for her is not something she does in her spare time. This is what she does to support herself for a living. And she also wants to create an image that looks very different than the cartoons that we were just looking at, right? So she's seated here. She's in kind of this domestic-like scene with flowers on the side, a book. She's also knitting. She has very simple, plain clothing, very dignified looking clothing, but nothing too frivolous. And you can see Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony have far more jewelry and lace than Sojourner Truth chooses to wear in her portrait. She really emphasizes that she's a working woman here. And at the bottom, it says, I shall the shadow to support the substance. A shadow in the 19th century was actually the same meant photograph, right? Because in the 19th century, they were creating photographs by exposing glass plates to the sunlight. So it's literally creating a shadow on the plate, and they were using it to support the substance, which was her physical self, as well as the substantial reforms that she hoped to put in place. So Anthony and Stanton, who we see on the other right here, Anthony's the one with the brown hair. Stanton is the one with the fluffy curly hair that people of that era said reminded them of Martha Washington. Anthony and Stanton see Truth's portrait and see the value of distributing an actual photograph of themselves to challenge these stereotypes. And they decide to do the same thing starting in 1870 when they sat for this photograph. You can see that they're a little bit less concerned with looking like a respectable, dignified woman. They're a little bit more concerned in showing that they are aggressive and even formidable, that they are out to challenge this system. By 1869, they had founded the first Women's Suffrage Association. They had also founded the newspaper The Revolution. So they were hardly subtle about what they were going for here. And these suffragists, they wanted to change people's minds, but, they did change political cartoons a little bit. Now little cartoonists really copied their photographs. They just made sure to specify precisely which suffragists they were making fun of. And so this is an illustration from 1873. You can see it precisely copies this photograph from 1870. Anthony stands with her hand on her hip. She's got her like Uncle Sam style hat askew on her head. And she's also holding an umbrella, which is similar to the way that a military officer might hold a sword. Her skirt is far too short for 19th century standards. And if you look really closely on her boots, you can see spurs on them. In the background, we've got a big women's political protest. Now, this is from 1873. Women are not participating in political protests. This is like an imagined scene. This is not something that suffragists are organizing yet. On the left side, we have a female police officer, and on the right side, we have yet again the scene of the end of the world, a man carrying a baby, and a man also getting groceries. And the artist here wanted to take it one step further to make sure everyone to really do a personal dig at Anthony. Anthony, you've probably seen a lot of portraits of her in profile. She was really self-conscious about an eye issue that she had. And so when you see her on the dollar coin in profile, it's because we have so many portraits of her in profile. But you can see that the artist actually decided to reproduce that eye issue into this illustration, which was just like a real strike at Anthony from this artist. But the suffragists wanted to keep fighting. They wanted to look more like these images of men in power. And you all can probably conjure up these perhaps in your own offices, perhaps on your university campuses that you've been to, and museums. These images of men in power were very much part of the culture and really are very much part of our culture today. And so they keep trying. So, this is from their really first major public image project called The History of Women's Suffrage, which was first published in 1881. Eventually, it became a 6-volume series, and each volume has about 1,000 pages in it, and it tells the history of women's suffrage, and it includes portraits of the people that the editors thought were important. Anthony Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage were the editors of the first several volumes. And of course, they decided that they certainly deserved a place there. As I mentioned at the front, though, they really told a very particular story, and they helped decide who would be the suffragists that we would remember today. So, for example, as I mentioned, they did not want to highlight Lucy Stone and her Boston organization too much. They also did not choose to include women of color who were really central activists to the suffrage movement. Despite the fact that Anthony even had a portrait of Sojourner Truth and easily could have had it made into an engraving for the book, she did not want to include her. She did not want a Black woman to represent her cause. The other group they did not include was men. Men, as you can guess, were incredibly valuable participants in the suffrage movement. You know, they were the ones who were able to hold office. They were the ones who were able to vote. So having them as allies and oftentimes as active participants in suffrage organizations was really essential. But they were all excluded from this history that told a very particular story. And in many ways, the story that was promoted in the history of women's suffrage is still very much part of our popular conversations today. But anti-suffragists, anti-women's rights activists are still continuing. This is a photograph, a stereo card from 1897. If you put it in a stereoscope, it would appear three-dimensional. A man is doing laundry, watching the children, while his wife is wearing bloomers and taking her bike out. And as she says on her way out, have dinner at 1, dear. So he is taking on all of her responsibilities. And during this time, the suffragists are organizing in a way that was really just unprecedented. So they are, by 1890, they have one central organization. It's no longer split up. And they also create national press committees, a publicity committee. They found their own publishing company. They hire publicity professionals. There's a new wave of professional female artists who are being trained in schools for the first time. All of those images that we were looking at earlier, those cartoons, those are by male artists, published by men in newspapers, edited by men. And there's a dramatic shift around the turn of the century to more female creators. And one of them is Blanche James, who is a local Bostonian. She created this image, and it's called Double the Power of the Home. 2 good votes are better than 1. And it features a woman with her 3 children in this idyllic scene. This is like a perfect home. It's got a God Bless Our Home sign on the back. There's like a teapot steaming in the background as well. And you can see that this is the kind of image that suffragists wanted the public to believe. They wanted the public to believe that this woman, with her perfect home, should vote. But as you can tell, it's a very particular woman, right? It's a white woman. She probably has enough money to stay home, and she's not required to work. These are the good voters that suffragists are really emphasizing here. You'll also notice that this is not an argument about equality. It's not saying that women need the vote because they are equal to men. It's actually saying that women need the vote because they're mothers. And this was an incredibly popular, incredibly powerful, and I would argue very successful argument at this time. This is an illustration by Rose O'Neill. And if you are familiar with Kewpie dolls, she's the same one who designed Kewpie dolls. It says, "Give mother the vote, we need it." And it emphasizes that these children want mothers to have a political voice in their food, their schools, and their play, their homes, etc. And so it's this idea that women are not going to abandon their homes. They're not going to abandon their families. They're actually going to extend their motherly caregiving expertise into the public political sphere. So that's one really popular argument at the time. And we can also see that there's a shift in the way that suffragists are stereotyped. This illustration is called "The Type Has Changed" from 1911. And this shows this frumpier suffragist transitioning into this beautiful, elegantly dressed suffragist with this fashionable hat and heels. And you can see that she looks incredibly similar to the idealized Gibson girl type that is on display at that time. But of course, these suffragists don't represent all the suffragists that were part of the movement. This is a photograph of Mary Church Terrell, who was one of the first Black women in the United States to earn an undergraduate degree, which she did from Oberlin College. And she actually went on to become the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, which was founded in 1896. And that organization was created because these women of color were looking at these white women led organizations and realizing that they weren't being allowed to participate equally. In some organizations were in fact segregated. They weren't able to participate in leadership positions. They weren't able to influence the agenda in any meaningful way. And as you can guess, by the 1890s, 1890 is when the Mississippi State Constitution is amended to start disenfranchising Black men in particular. And there's a wave of disenfranchisement in the South of Black men using poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, all of these things. So it's not just, these women don't just want the vote for themselves, they want the vote for their husbands, for their fathers, for their uncles. They're also seeing a rise in violence against Black people in the late 19th century. And in 1896, the same year that the National Association of Colored Women is founded, that's the same year as the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which decides that segregation is legal. So there are a lot of things on their agenda when they start out. And unfortunately, their organization has often been left out of kind of popular stories of suffrage. But it's true that they were thinking about suffrage, they were fighting for suffrage, but it was just one of many things that they wanted to accomplish in order to create a more just society. And Mary Church Terrell was very much part of that. She was really an iconic leader of this movement. She is pictured here. This is a photograph, an illustration that she distributed on for one of her talks. She was incredibly well-known public speaker, not only for suffrage, but also for civil rights. She, in fact, picketed segregated restaurants in Washington, D.C. in the 1950s, even when she was in her 80s. So she led this incredibly long, accomplished life. And you can see that, these two portraits are incredibly similar. This is the right, we have an image of an idealized new Negro woman. And this is the kind of image that Terrell wanted to portray, this elegant, refined, respectable woman as the kind of the face of women's, Black women's activism. So in 1913, we talked about Inez Milholland's photograph at the head of the suffrage parade as the herald. Inez Milholland was incredibly important because she was actually able to convince the leaders of that parade to allow Black women to march. So Mary Church Terrell marched. She marched with college graduates, but also the Delta Sigma Thetas of Howard University marched. Ida B. Wells, who came in from Chicago, came to march with the Illinois delegation. And so this was an incredibly important moment. But I'm going to show you a racist stereotype just to give you a sense of what Terrell is up against here. This is an illustration from 1913. It's making fun of the white suffragists for not wanting the Black women to march with them, but it's also mocking these Black women. It's showing them with these exaggerated racist features. It's showing them in these disheveled clothes, unfashionable attire. They're not standing very ladylike. So this is an image that Mary Church Terrell is very much trying to challenge when we're looking at portraits like that one. So this image is really special because it's very different from the others. All the ones that I've showed you previously were images that Americans encountered over and over and over again in newspapers, in magazines, in books, etc. This one is incredibly unusual, far rarer. And it was printed by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It was printed as a poster, which is what this is. It was also printed in their magazine called The Crisis. And it's the only image I found in my many, many years of suffrage research that actually emphasizes that Black women need the vote, particularly as mothers. None of the propaganda, the illustrations from the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the organization led by white women, featured women of color. And unfortunately, the National Association of Colored Women had far fewer resources, and they really were not able to kind of create the propaganda, create the media in the same way that the National American Women's Suffrage Association did. So we have very little of this kind of material. This is called the South's Battalion of Death. And it's a Black woman who holds a bat labeled the Federal Constitution. And she's beating down segregation, Jim Crow laws, and grandfather clauses. And she's doing that in order to protect her children, very much like the propaganda for white suffragists that we were looking at earlier. It's about women as protectors for their families. And the idea here is that people don't want women's voting rights because they realize that it could enfranchise Black women too. And so at the bottom, it says what votes for women means to the South. And this is the suggestion is that this is the main reason why why Southern states rather are opposing women's suffrage is because they realize that Black women may gain political power. So when we're thinking about kind of the final push for women's voting rights, it's fair to say that this idea of women as caregivers, as patriotic citizens was incredibly powerful. And I think that World War I, with the propaganda that looks very similar to this, The Greatest Mother in the World from 1917, showing this woman who is cradling this soldier, trying to care for him. And so this idea that that this is how women are being patriotic citizens is really vital here. And there's one connection to our own pandemic moment that stands out to me now more than ever. And that's that Woodrow Wilson in 1918 addressed the Senate on September 30th, and he told them to endorse women's suffrage, pass the amendment. And unfortunately, they didn't do that immediately. And within the week, the 1918 flu pandemic kind of took over Washington, D.C., and the city was essentially shut down. A lot of political leaders got ill. They had to close down the public spaces in this nation's capital. And we can we have our own experience of how this pandemic really can shape what's happening in politics. And so this actually, the 19th Amendment doesn't actually pass both houses of Congress until the following spring, when the flu has died down a little bit. And so there's in between this moment, not only have women demonstrated that they are important nurses and caregivers during World War I, they've demonstrated that they are nurses and caregivers, professionally, but also just informally in their communities during the pandemic. And you can imagine that might certainly, influence the ways that people really valued women as citizens. And so, as we all know, the 19th Amendment passed, but it was certainly not the end of the story. Sometimes you'll see language, in celebration commemoration saying the 19th Amendment guaranteed women the right to vote. But that's not true. It actually prohibits voter discrimination based on sex. So a lot of the laws that were put in place to disenfranchise Black men, poll taxes, literacy tests, etc., those still applied to people, to women after the passage of the 19th Amendment. So Black women in the South faced significant trouble trying to register and vote after the 19th Amendment. Asian American women didn't actually gain the right to vote in the United States until the 1940s. Native American women did not really gain widespread citizenship until 1924. The 19th Amendment is just one milestone in this much longer conversation about voting rights that was happening over the 19th century, the 20th century. And I think we could say that this conversation about voting rights is still happening in 2022. So just a reminder that this is your opportunity to cast your vote. You've seen how much people have challenged women's right to vote in the past, which, as a historian, it makes me value that opportunity ever more in our present moment. And if you're interested in learning more about these images and seeing more of them and finding out more about this story, you are welcome to check out my book. It's available at Amazon and your local favorite bookstore. But if you decide you'd like to purchase it through the University of Chicago Press website, they will give you 20% off with the code UCPNew. So I am very excited to answer your questions and see what you guys think. Feel free to throw in your thoughts into the chat, and we will talk.
as we wait for all the questions to come in. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I learned so much. Like you said, not a lot of this in our history books growing up. So really, really compelling, so much information. I feel like I can't wait to learn even more. So thank you so much for being with us tonight and spending your evening here.
I'm happy to be here. And someone already posted in the chat about Mary Poppins, which I, if any of you remember the Sister Suffragette song, probably one of my first encounters with suffrage, right? I mean, when you look at it now, you can see that it's mocking them a little bit, right? It's a joke, but I don't think I really got it the first time I saw it. So that's a great, yeah, that's a great example. Thanks for pointing that out. Popular history recommendations. So one that's gotten a lot of press that I enjoyed, that I thought was really interesting, is called The Woman's Hour. And that's by Elaine Weiss, Weiss. And that one, I think you'll be hearing a lot more about, because Hillary Clinton is producing and Steven Spielberg is directing some sort of series that is going to be based on this book. And the book is actually about a very small component of the suffrage movement. It's about the final fight to convince the Tennessee state legislature to ratify the 19th Amendment. Tennessee was the final state needed to ratify. And obviously suffragists were successful, but we kind of think of the 19th Amendment as almost inevitable. Like, of course, why would this not pass? But one of the things you'll see in this book is that there was a lot of negotiating behind the scenes to make that happen. Another book that is just like off to the side, just far enough out of my reach to not be able to grab easily, is called Vanguard by Martha Jones. And one of the things that's really cool about the new books about women's voting rights that are coming out right now is that there are so many that are focusing on the ways that women of color were essential to the movement. And Vanguard is really about the ways that Black women were leaders, were participants in voting rights movements. And so I would also recommend checking that one out too. I'm also just starting to read Once and Future Witches, which is a novel, but that is also, I've only just started it. It's gotten some great reviews, but it also has some suffragists in it. So it's a little bit sillier. Oh, and also the other thing you could look at is there is a blog series by the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, which was actually a commission I was on. It's for the United States Congress. And it is a collection of posts, really short essays by some of the most amazing scholars about kind of like the latest, greatest new finds, new research on the suffrage movement. So it's the Suff Buffs is the name of the blog. So a lot of comments on on the Mary Poppins, are all of our Mary Poppins experiences. I totally relate. Oh, the witch book is called, oh my goodness. It's by Alex Hart. It's called Once and Future Witches. So it is, I'm not very far into it, but it's a very lovely, somehow seasonal, given that it's about suffrage and witches. It's just like the perfect October read for us, I think. And yeah, as I said, the reviews of it have been great. So I think I'm enjoying reading it. There's also a new documentary by PBS American Experience that should be online, and it's called The Vote, and it's specifically on suffrage in the 1910s. So if you're interested in kind of getting an even more visual presentation, they were able to find some really cool film footage of parades that I had no idea this footage existed. So that was really something I would recommend too. And yes, on the website, there should be links to the digital versions of the exhibitions that I curated. Not quite the same as being there in person, but I think that they should also give you a good taste. For those of you who are in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Historical Society is one that is specifically focused on the women's voting rights movement in Massachusetts. And one of the things that you might find interesting is that Massachusetts was certainly home to many, many women's rights activists, but it was also home to the very first anti-women's suffrage organization, also founded by women, which was created in 1895. So that was really interesting. And the Massachusetts Historical Society has a ton of anti-women's suffrage papers, which gives you a little bit of a sense of how that organization felt about suffrage 100 years ago. They were very interested. Very closely affiliated with anti-suffragists. Here's a question about thoughts on the current state of how women are portrayed in regards to femininity. It still feels like there's somewhat of a bias towards women in power. And I think that you are very correct on that interpretation. You know, I mentioned when we were looking at that print from 1869, this comment about the man tamer. Some of you might remember that when Hillary Clinton ran for president, there were nutcrackers made in her likeness. You know, this is something that is still very much part of our society, to critique women who are seeking, who are ambitious, who are seeking really visible positions of leadership. This is something that you are right, still is part of our society today, this animosity, this aggressiveness. The other thing that's still part of our conversations today about women in power is also this inclination towards emphasizing caregiving and motherhood and all of these kind of more like motherly responsibilities, to emphasize that you're not just a leader, but also a caregiver. And for example, we saw when Kamala Harris accepted the vice presidential nomination, she introduced herself as Mamala. So she actually doesn't have children of her own, but is a stepmother. But she wanted people to know that she did have this caregiving role in her life. And if you caught any of the pre-confirmation hearings for the new Supreme Court justice, you notice that there was a lot of conversations about her family, about how she cared for her family, who cared for her family in her household. So this is still something that is just an essential part, for better or for worse, of our society today, that women are still having to kind of negotiate these questions. The next question I see here is, sometimes we can see that we are our own worst enemy. Can you speak to common themes that emerged as some women didn't support the right to vote, and how some women continue to fight against the advancement of women's rights? This is a fantastic question. There are plenty of examples of women who didn't support the right, who actively organized against the right to vote. And a lot of times these women were wealthier women. You know, they were women who perhaps were able to have dinner with the governor and not just influence them by casting a ballot, right? They were women who believed that they had power within the home and that power was really worthwhile. Whereas a lot of working women, they weren't sitting at home all day. They didn't have that opportunity. It's not, they were working alongside perhaps their male partners, perhaps even their children at some points. And so seeing the home as this domestic sacred space that was somehow powerful on its own was not really valuable to working women. And I think that in some ways, those rifts are still part of our conversations today, based on class, based on race. A lot of the divisions that we saw emerging among women's voting rights activists, even in the 1860s, especially among women of color and white women, those divisions, were part of the rest of the movement, and I think still fracture women's rights activists today as well. And so Yes, we have Amy Klobuchar showing off her cooking prowess. There's also a delightful video of Kamala Harris cooking, oh my goodness, samosas, I think, with Mindy Kaling. It's a super delightful video, but why does she have to show us that she can cook? I'm not sure. If there is a comparable video of male presidential candidates doing such a thing, I haven't seen it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but perhaps you all will will have seen something like that out there. But yeah.
I'll just give it another couple seconds if anyone has any last minute questions, but our hour is coming to a close. So again, I just want to thank you so much for your time tonight. And also, I can't wait when all this is over, we would love to invite you to our beautiful headquarters on Newbury Street and have you again, because this was just such a wonderful talk. So thank you again. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Everyone on the